there any proof Jesus existed outside the Bible?
Is the New Testament historically accurate?
This is important because the Bible is not just a religious book. It's one of the primary historical sources for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're not talking about theology and religious teachings found in the letters of Paul. I'm not talking about what Jesus actually taught. I'm talking about what Jesus actually did. How do we know Jesus really did these things, especially the historical details regarding the resurrection? Can we really trust the New Testament? Ever since the manuscript discoveries of 2010 and 2016, we know that the New Testament was written between AD 50 and 75. Yes, I know there's ongoing debate about the hypothetical Q source material being written in AD 40, but I don't believe in Q. There's no evidence. So that's at least 20 years after Jesus left the earth. A lot of stories and details can change in 20 years, but lucky for us, Jesus was born into a culture with a very strong oral tradition, the Jewish people. For us today, reading and writing are so readily available, but it wasn't like that for any culture in the first century. Writing existed, but it wasn't practical for the general public until the printing press was invented. But Jewish historians will tell you, especially in first century Judaism, the oral tradition was pretty much word for word.
A lot of kids who come for their bar and bar mitzvah when they're 13, they read a chunk of their haftarah, which comes from the prophets like Isaiah or Ezekiel, and they read a small chunk from the Torah itself, and many of those kids wind up memorizing those chunks.
Is it word for word or is it general idea?
It was definitely word for word because it's a chanting, it's not a teaching and it's not an explanation. They chanted in Hebrew.
Young Jewish boys would learn from a very early age to memorize from the Torah, passages word for word. They claim this has been going on since the time of Moses.
At Mount Sinai is where we got the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but at the same time, Moses was also given an oral tradition, which eventually became the Mishnah and the Talmud and eventually was written down. The Mishnah, compiled in 200 CE, is but it's compiled from teachings of the last 200 or so years, depending on how you want to count, maybe even 300 or 400. But my understanding is it was still a little while longer before it was actually written down.
The Mishnah, the most essential part of the Jewish religion, was finally written down only after centuries of oral tradition.
The Mishnah is written to be memorized. A person's job it was to be the Mishnah, to memorize it completely and pass it on to the next person. And then they would recite, without any commentary, what they had memorized.
Wow.
Especially in the time period when books would have been still pretty rare.
Right.
I suspect at the time there were a number of oral traditions that were still pretty serious. I would say the difference, the unique aspect of Judaism is the reverence for the oral tradition.
The holy text was transmitted word of mouth, word for word. The Talmud in the Jewish religion says that one should memorize word for word even when you don't understand what you're saying. And this is the culture and context in which the Gospels was written down. Just like any pupil following a rabbi in Jewish culture, teachings will be memorized word for word. This is how they practiced religion. And if they thought their own rabbi was the Messiah, you don't think they would pay attention even more and memorize even harder? Plus, the Gospels is historically and geographically accurate. The way it describes certain cities in the first century are recently proven by modern archaeology. Now, this might be a weak argument because we have historical fiction in which fictional stories take place in modern places, even today, like LA or Los Angeles. But there's also the proof of fulfilled prophecy. Jesus said that Jerusalem would be destroyed, and it happened exactly as he said 40 years later in 70 AD. Now you might say, oh, that's just pure coincidence because Jerusalem got destroyed many times. Yes, but Jesus also spoke judgment against 3 other ancient cities, and they were all destroyed in 400 AD, never to be rebuilt again. Coincidence, you might say, because ancient cities got destroyed all the time. Yes, but ancient cities got rebuilt all the time. Of the 4 ancient cities surrounding the Sea of Galilee, Jesus spoke out against 3 of them, and they were all destroyed, never to be rebuilt. But the 4th one, that Jesus did not speak out against, Tiberias, is still standing today. Now, that's not powerful proof, but it's still something to consider. Now, the best proof for the historicity of the New Testament comes from modern archaeology. Now, archaeology cannot prove that the Bible is from God, but it does show that Luke was a very accurate historian. For example, skeptics said Luke was wrong. There was no Roman census during the time of Jesus' birth. They didn't all have to go home, and Quirinius was not the governor. But archaeology proved Luke right on all three counts. Skeptics also said that Luke was inaccurate when he said that Iconium was not in Lycaonia, because the Roman writer Cicero said it was. Now, who's right? Is Luke wrong because the New Testament is not considered historical? Several archaeological discoveries showed that Luke was right. Here's a short list. People said that Luke was wrong, that there was no proof, but writings and inscriptions have validated Luke as a legit historian. Now, what else did Luke write about? Thanks for watching part 1. Now click on the left for part 2. It shows how non-Christian writings of the 1st century and archaeology prove the existence of Jesus.